The room fell silent as Donald Trump leaned forward, smirking with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. His voice cut through the air like a blade, brash and unapologetic, laced with the familiar swagger of someone who thrived on chaos. He threw his jab across the stage, a line meant to belittle, to provoke, to remind the audience that he still saw himself as the showman-in-chief. Cameras zoomed in, the crowd leaned forward. And then, in a moment that no one had predicted, Kamala Harris lifted her eyes, paused, and delivered a line that made America gasp. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was something far more devastating. Calm, precise, a truth wrapped in dignity. The kind of response that doesn't just silence a man like Trump, it exposes him. The words hung in the air, lingering long after they were spoken, as if time itself had frozen to make sure every person watching understood what had just happened. Across living rooms, bars, and phones glowing in the night, people looked at each other with wide eyes. Did she just say that? In that instant, the debate wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a reckoning, a clash between arrogance and composure, bluster and resilience, a man who thrived on volume, and a woman who chose precision. But how did we get to this moment? How did a single exchange on a stage already heavy with history become the spark that could shift the course of an entire election? This was not just about politics. It was about identity, about dignity, about what kind of country America wanted to see when it looked in the mirror. Trump's smirk had been more than a smile. It was the mask of certainty, the belief that intimidation would once again carry the night. But Harris's response had cracked it, just for a second, just enough for millions watching to wonder if the performance was finally unraveling. And yet, this was only the beginning. What happened in those first minutes was a hint of the storm to come, a foreshadowing of a clash that would leave the audience reeling, pundits scrambling, and social media on fire. Because if one line could shake the stage, what came next would shake the nation.
This debate was never supposed to be ordinary. From the moment the camera switched on, the stage felt less like a forum of ideas and more like an arena. The stakes were not just about who scored points, who interrupted whom, or who managed the sharpest soundbite. The stakes were about the soul of America. Two visions of the country faced each other under those blinding lights. One vision built on nostalgia, division, and dominance, and the other on inclusion, dignity, and the promise of renewal. Donald Trump knew his role. He leaned into it with the familiar bravado of a man who believes conflict is his fuel. He had come to rattle, to provoke, to overwhelm with noise. Every raised eyebrow, every scoff, every sarcastic aside was calculated to make his opponent look small, to remind viewers of his presence. He didn't need to offer clarity. He only needed to cast doubt, to make the stage his stage. But Kamala Harris understood something deeper. She wasn't just there as a candidate. She was there as a symbol. For millions of immigrants, for women who had fought to be heard in boardrooms and classrooms, for families who had been told they didn't belong, her presence carried weight. Her very posture on that stage was a rebuttal to decades of exclusion. She didn't need to raise her voice to prove strength. She needed only to stand firm, to wait for the moment when truth could pierce the spectacle. The audience could sense it. This wasn't just a performance. It was a collision course. Every line Trump hurled was a test. Every calm rebuttal Harris offered was a counterweight. And somewhere in that balance, viewers at home began to feel the gravity of what was unfolding. Commentators had hyped this as a showdown, but it was quickly becoming something larger. The debate had become a reflection of America's crossroads. Would the future be shaped by the loudest voice in the room, or by the steady conviction of someone who refused to be intimidated? The stakes extended beyond the walls of that hall. In living rooms across the nation, parents sat with children who asked, "Who's winning?" Immigrants saw themselves in Harris's composure, finding pride in her calm. Young voters scrolled on their phones, ready to clip, to meme, to amplify whatever moment felt like history in the making. And then came the whispering thought, the spark of anticipation. If that opening exchange had left the country breathless, what was still to come? What happens when Trump, unaccustomed to being outmaneuvered, decides to double down? And what happens when Harris, armed with patience and precision, finally seizes her opening? The first clash had only whetted the appetite. The crowd wanted more. The nation wanted more. The stakes had never been higher, because what came next could change everything. Donald Trump did not walk onto that debate stage as a blank slate. He carried with him the weight of years of spectacle, scandal, and survival. To his supporters, he was the man who had defied the establishment, a fighter who said what others were too afraid to say. To his critics, he was the embodiment of arrogance, chaos in human form, a man whose bluster masked a hollow core. But no matter which side you were on, one truth was undeniable. Trump knew how to command a room. He thrived on confrontation, the way a fire thrives on oxygen. For decades, Trump had fashioned himself as the ultimate showman. Long before the Oval Office, he had stood under the golden lights of reality television, playing the role of the decisive boss, barking, "You're fired," as if it were more than entertainment, as if it were destiny. He learned that volume could masquerade as strength, that dominance could be confused with leadership. It was a lesson he carried with him into politics, and one that had carried him further than most thought possible. But behind the performance was a pattern. Every insult, every jab, every interruption was not spontaneous. It was strategy. Trump understood the power of chaos. When others were playing by rules, he was rewriting them in real time. When opponents tried to present ideas, he drowned them in noise. When facts cornered him, he pivoted to bravado. And when dignity tried to stand tall, he laughed, mocked, and smirked. It was a dance he had perfected, and in his eyes, it always worked. On this stage, however, something felt different. Trump's swagger was still there, his interruptions sharp, his confidence unshaken, but the audience could sense the repetition. The smirk that once unsettled rivals now felt rehearsed. The interruptions that once dominated began to sound predictable. His strength was his showmanship, but showmanship relies on surprise, and America had seen this show before. Still, Trump leaned hard into the persona. He believed volume equaled control. He believed sneering dismissals could undercut his opponent's legitimacy. When Harris spoke about policy, he scoffed. When she mentioned justice, he rolled his eyes. When she stood in silence, refusing to be baited, he pushed harder, raising his voice as if sheer force could shift reality. The irony was that his very tactics revealed his vulnerability. Trump feared being ignored. He feared silence more than criticism, dismissal more than debate. His interruptions weren't just attacks, they were shields, desperate attempts to keep the spotlight from drifting. Because for Trump, losing control of the stage meant losing the one thing he had always relied on, the illusion of dominance. And yet, millions still leaned in, compelled by the spectacle. Some admired his bravado, calling it strength. Others cringed at the arrogance, wondering how much longer America could endure the performance. But either way, Trump had made himself the center of attention once again. He had entered the stage not just as a candidate, but as a caricature of himself, larger than life, impossible to ignore, and convinced that intimidation would still work. What Trump didn't expect, what he couldn't anticipate, was the subtle shift happening before his eyes. Kamala Harris was not rattled. She did not stumble, did not fumble, did not shrink. Her calm was unnerving, her patience deliberate. While Trump doubled down on the only playbook he knew, Harris was quietly setting the stage for something he had never encountered before. A response that wasn't just a rebuttal, but a revelation. And so, the tension built. Trump's story was familiar, his strategy predictable. But Harris's story, that was still unfolding. And it was precisely in that contrast, the bluster of the past against the dignity of the present, that the true drama of the night began to take shape. Because if Trump was the noise America had come to know, Harris was about to become the silence that made the noise irrelevant. Kamala Harris did not arrive on that debate stage by accident. Her story was carved out of struggle, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of a place at the table. To many Americans, she represented more than a candidate. She represented possibility. The daughter of immigrants, her mother from India, her father from Jamaica, Harris grew up in a household that understood both the weight of sacrifice and the power of ambition. Her mother, Shyamala, used to remind her, "You may be the first, but make sure you're not the last." Those words echoed through every step of her journey. Harris learned early what it meant to be underestimated. As a young Black and South Asian woman pursuing law in spaces where she was often the only one who looked like her, she learned to let skepticism roll off her back. She learned to listen more than she spoke, and when she did speak, to make her words matter. That discipline, born in classrooms and courtrooms, forged a weapon stronger than volume: precision. Her career as a prosecutor was not without controversy. She was tested, scrutinized, criticized from all sides, but it hardened her resolve. She stood in courtrooms facing men who underestimated her, lawyers who dismissed her, criminals who smirked at her presence. Yet again and again, she proved that composure could be more devastating than noise. She became known not for theatrics, but for her ability to pin down contradictions with surgical calm. She asked the questions others avoided. She held her gaze when others blinked, and slowly, her reputation grew. By the time she entered national politics, Harris had already cultivated a presence that unnerved those who relied on chaos. Senate hearings showed her sharpest weapon, the pause. She asked a question, then let the silence do the work. Witnesses stumbled, politicians grew restless, and audiences leaned in.
She understood that silence, wielded correctly, was not weakness, it was control. On the debate stage with Donald Trump, all of that history became visible in an instant. Every trial, every late night of preparation, every moment of being underestimated, it was all preparation for this very moment. Trump's smirks and interruptions were not new to her. They were echoes of battles she had fought her entire life. Men who thought they could rattle her. Men who believed volume equaled dominance. Men who had never seen their power questioned until someone refused to play by their rules. Harris's calm presence wasn't just personality, it was strategy shaped by years of survival. For immigrants, for women, for people of color watching across America, she carried the weight of their stories. She was their proof that the American dream was not just a slogan, it could stand on that stage, go toe-to-toe with bluster, and not back down. Her laughter, sometimes criticized, sometimes misunderstood, was part of that strategy too. It wasn't nervousness, it was defiance, a refusal to let arrogance define the moment. When Trump scoffed, when he interrupted, when he tried to belittle, Harris's smile became a mirror, reflecting back the absurdity of his antics. For some, that laugh was a release. For others, it was a rallying cry. We don't have to take this seriously because dignity is stronger than insults. In this backstory lies the heart of Harris's role in the debate. She was not the loudest voice. She was not the showman. She was the steady presence who had been underestimated too many times to count and had turned every underestimation into fuel. And as the minutes ticked by, it became clear Harris was not just playing defense. She was waiting for the perfect moment to use her precision, to deliver a line so sharp, so unflinching, that it would slice through the noise and shift the entire energy of the room. Because if Trump's story was arrogance mistaken for strength, Harris's story was resilience mistaken for fragility. And in that collision lay the drama that millions had tuned in to witness. Her backstory was not just prologue, it was the setup for the moment that was about to come. A moment that would remind America that dignity is not weakness and silence is not surrender. And when that moment arrived, it would not just leave Trump rattled, it would leave the entire country holding its breath. The debate did not move forward gently. It erupted, piece by piece, as Donald Trump leaned harder into the only strategy he trusted: disruption. He interrupted Kamala Harris mid-sentence, speaking over her with a tone that mixed sarcasm and swagger. Each time she began to outline policy, he cut in with jabs, throwing off rhythm, trying to remind the audience that the stage belonged to him. For years, this had been his bread and butter, overwhelmed with noise until his opponents stumbled. But this time, the formula began to look shaky. Harris did not stumble. She did not plead with the moderator. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she paused, waited, and looked directly at him, as though studying a man performing a trick everyone had already seen. The more he pushed, the calmer she became. That calmness, infuriating to him, began to rattle his performance. The escalation became visible in his body language. Trump leaned forward aggressively, his hands slicing through the air, his voice louder with every interjection. He accused her of weakness, of incompetence, of being a phony, his words dripping with the same disdain he had used on countless opponents before. But unlike others who had taken the bait, Harris refused to wrestle in the mud. Her strength was not in matching his chaos, it was in showing America that chaos no longer worked. The crowd could feel the tension growing. Trump's interruptions turned into monologues, his confidence teetering between bravado and desperation. Harris, meanwhile, sharpened her timing. Each pause, each patient breath became its own weapon. When she finally spoke, her words landed with clarity against the wall of noise. It was the contrast itself, his disorder against her discipline, that created the drama. And the audience at home felt it. Social media buzzed in real time. She's not flinching. She's not backing down. Clips began circulating mid-debate, side-by-side shots of Trump waving his arms wildly, while Harris sat composed, unbothered, her eyes locked on him. Still, the escalation had not yet peaked. Trump, sensing he was losing control of the stage, doubled down. He hurled accusations, cut off the moderator, and sneered at Harris as though sheer force could tilt the room back in his favor. But Harris knew the rhythm of his game. She let him talk. She let the noise swell, and with each passing minute, the anticipation built. She was waiting for her moment. The escalation was not simply about volume, it was about patience. The louder Trump became, the more the audience leaned in, waiting for the counterstrike. Harris was building tension, creating space for one moment, one line that would not just quiet the noise, but collapse it completely. And that moment was coming. because while Trump believed the debate was his stage, Harris was about to show him and the entire nation that sometimes the most powerful move is to let arrogance talk itself into a corner and then strike with precision so sharp it cannot be ignored.
It began with silence. Trump had just finished another barrage of interruptions, a scattershot of accusations and insults delivered with the intensity of a man convinced that speed and noise could bury truth. His voice ricocheted across the hall, his gestures animated, his smirk almost daring Harris to lose her composure. The moderator struggled to regain order, but the chaos hung in the air like thick smoke. And then Harris waited. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't rush to defend herself. She simply looked at him, her expression calm, her posture unshaken. The silence stretched just long enough to make the audience uncomfortable, just long enough for Trump to shift in his stance. It was a pause that screamed louder than any interruption. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was measured, steady, deliberate. "Mr. Trump," she began, her tone quiet but commanding, "you can keep shouting, but shouting doesn't make you right." The line hit like a thunderclap. The crowd reacted in a wave, some gasping, some clapping, others leaning forward as if they had just witnessed history being written in real time. The power of her words wasn't in their volume, but in their precision. For years, Trump had thrived by baiting his opponents into shouting matches, dragging them into his arena of noise. Harris had just flipped the script, disarming him with composure that was sharper than any insult. Trump tried to fire back immediately, his instinct pushing him to interrupt again. But for the first time, his words stumbled. The smirk faltered. He muttered something about fake news, his cadence suddenly uneven, the swagger punctured. Harris had landed her first clean blow, and the room knew it. She didn't stop there. Harris leaned into her strength, the ability to turn a single moment into a revelation. She spoke of America not as a stage for spectacle, but as a country in need of healing. She contrasted Trump's noise with the struggles of real families, mothers working double shifts, immigrants building businesses, young people drowning in debt. Every sentence was anchored in dignity, in lived reality, in a moral vision larger than the man standing across from her. And then came the line, the one that would ricochet across phones, headlines, and living rooms for days to come. She looked straight at Trump, the corners of her mouth lifting to that deliberate smile, and said, "The presidency isn't a reality show. It's reality for the people you hurt." The hall erupted. Viewers at home felt the air shift. Social media exploded within seconds, hashtags forming like sparks in dry grass. The moment was instantly clipped, instantly memed, instantly celebrated as the mic drop that silenced the noise. Harris's words didn't just dismantle Trump, they reframed the entire debate. Trump's face told the story. His arms folded defensively, his voice raised again, but the effect was different now. The confidence looked brittle, the interruptions desperate. Harris, meanwhile, sat poised, her calm magnified by contrast. She had done what no one thought possible. She had shifted the gravity of the debate away from him and toward her vision of leadership. The beauty of the counterattack wasn't just in the line, it was in the timing. Harris had endured the storm of interruptions, the cascade of insults, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The audience recognized it instinctively. It wasn't just strategy, it was mastery. A lifetime of being underestimated had prepared her for this stage, and in that instant, she showed America what resilience looks like when it finally meets its moment. Commentators in real time began tweeting, "Harris just ended Trump's dominance on this stage." Others posted, "That's the line that will be replayed 1,000,000 times before November." The floodgates opened. Memes, reaction GIFs, hashtags like reality, not reality show trended before the debate was even over. But the true power of the mic drop wasn't digital, it was emotional. In living rooms across the country, immigrants nodded with pride. Women who had been talked over in meetings, dismissed in classrooms, or underestimated in their careers felt a surge of validation. Young people, often skeptical of politics, felt the electricity of a moment that spoke directly to their frustrations. Harris hadn't just defeated Trump's tactic, she had spoken for those who lived under the weight of arrogance every day. Trump, meanwhile, struggled to regain footing. He raised his voice louder, attacked more personally, but each attempt felt smaller, weaker. The audience could see it. The king of chaos had been rattled, the mask of invincibility cracked. For the first time in years, Trump didn't look untouchable. He looked shaken. Harris leaned into that shift. She didn't gloat, she didn't raise her volume. Instead, she turned to the people, not the man across from her. She spoke directly to the camera. This election isn't about him. It's about you. It's about whether your family has dignity, whether your kids have opportunity, whether your country finally chooses compassion over chaos. And just like that, she reframed the debate entirely. Trump had wanted a duel of personalities. Harris had turned it into a referendum on values. The mic drop wasn't just a takedown, it was a turning point. By the end of her counterattack, the stage felt transformed. The audience knew they had just witnessed the climax of the night, the line that would echo long after the debate ended.
Trump's noise had been drowned out not by louder noise, by something infinitely more powerful: clarity. And as Harris leaned back, composed, the moderator struggling to restore order once again, one thought lingered in the minds of millions watching. If this was just the beginning of her fight, what shockwaves would come when the world reacted?
The moment the debate ended, the shockwaves began. It wasn't just a line, it was the line. Within seconds, phones lit up across the country. Clips of Kamala Harris's mic drop response flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, each edit more dramatic than the last. Someone slowed the video down, overlaying it with a cinematic soundtrack. Another spliced in the crowd's gasps and Trump's faltering expression, turning it into a meme that spread like wildfire. The hashtag #RealityNotRealityShow hit the trending charts before Harris had even left the stage. Cable news scrambled to keep up. Commentators who had predicted another Trump-dominated spectacle now admitted the night belonged to Harris. One anchor leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. That was the moment, folks. That was the turning point. Others dissected Trump's body language frame by frame, pointing out the hesitation, the defensive arm cross, the crack in the armor that America wasn't used to seeing. But the true ripple effect wasn't confined to the studios. It was unfolding in living rooms, cafes, and dorm rooms across the country. Immigrant families replayed the clip, parents nudging their children. See? That's why you never let anyone shout you down. Women shared it in group chats, texting each other in all caps. She did that! Young people who often tuned out of politics stitched the clip into TikToks with captions like, "This is the energy we've been waiting for." Even celebrities weighed in. Actors, musicians, athletes, people with millions of followers posted their reactions. Some called it the line that ended the debate. Others declared Harris had spoken for every woman ever interrupted by a man in power. The cultural echo chamber magnified what had already felt seismic on stage. Suddenly, it wasn't just political. It was personal, relatable, viral. Trump, for his part, tried to spin the night as a win. He launched a series of late-night posts on his social media platform, railing against the moderators, accusing Harris of being scripted, claiming the media was rigged against him. But the tone felt familiar, almost tired. His posts, once dominating news cycles, were now drowned out by endless replays of Harris's line. The louder he shouted online, the more desperate it sounded. Meanwhile, Harris's campaign capitalized instantly. Within hours, her team had clipped the exchange into a 30-second ad, already circulating on YouTube and television spots. Donations poured in, small dollar contributions from first-time donors who wrote comments like, "That line gave me chills," and "For the first time in years, I feel hope." Internationally, the moment made headlines too. Newspapers in Europe and Asia described it as Harris outmaneuvering Trump with grace. Editorials framed it as a defining test of leadership, calm dignity in the face of chaos. The debate, once expected to be another chaotic spectacle, had instead turned into a showcase of contrast that resonated far beyond America's borders. But perhaps the true telling sign of the shockwaves came from ordinary people. In community centers, on college campuses, in barbershops and diners, the conversation kept circling back to the same theme. She didn't just stand up to him, she stood up for us. For many who had felt silenced, overlooked, or shouted down in their own lives, Harris's composure was more than politics. It was vindication. The aftermath wasn't about who won the debate. It was about who owned the moment. And that moment, without question, belonged to Harris. Trump had thrown every tactic he had, every insult in his arsenal, and still the line lingered. Not his words, hers. And yet, as the dust settled, a new question emerged. If Harris could create this kind of cultural earthquake in a single night, what would happen when the campaign trail amplified it 1,000 times over? What would happen when this moment, now etched into the public imagination, became the lens through which voters viewed every future clash? The answer was unclear, but one thing was undeniable. The debate had sent shockwaves through the nation, and they were only just beginning to ripple outward. Because if Harris's mic drop could silence Trump for one night, the world was left wondering, could it silence him for good? In the days after the debate, the clip wasn't just political fodder anymore. It had transformed into something deeper, almost symbolic. People weren't quoting polls or dissecting policy charts. They were repeating that one line, replaying it in their minds, as if it had cracked open a long-sealed door. For many, it wasn't just Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. It was dignity versus derision, truth versus spectacle, calm against chaos. Harris, when asked about it in interviews, didn't boast. She didn't replay the tape or gloat about silencing Trump. Instead, she reframed the moment. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice steady. "This is about what kind of country we want to be. Do we want a country where noise wins or where truth endures?" That subtle pivot gave the line even more power. It wasn't simply a comeback. It was a call to choose values over volume. And that was the moral heartbeat reverberating among her supporters.
Teachers told their students about the exchange, weaving it into lessons about listening before speaking. Community leaders cited it as proof that grace under pressure could triumph over bluster. Even some independents, long skeptical of both parties, admitted they saw in Harris a poise that felt absent in American politics. For immigrants and first-generation families, the symbolism ran even deeper. Here was the daughter of immigrants, standing on the largest stage in American politics, refusing to be shouted down. It wasn't just her win, it was theirs. Parents whispered to their children, "She's proof you belong here. Proof you don't have to scream to be heard. Proof that no matter how loud the storm, dignity can be louder." Meanwhile, Trump's camp tried to move on, pushing fresh attacks, scheduling rallies, pivoting the news cycle. But something had shifted. His insults, once delivered with swagger, now carried the echo of that night's silence, the silence after Harris's words cut through the chaos. His performance had reinforced the image his critics had long painted, not a fighter for truth, but a showman addicted to applause. The lesson was clear. This debate wasn't just about policy. It was about tone, temperament, and truth. And Harris's restraint had revealed a paradox. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that refuses to shout. Social media reflected that moral turn. Posts with captions like "Dignity wins" and "Volume isn't strength" spread far beyond political circles. It was no longer only about left versus right. It was about the universal longing for leaders who lift people up rather than tear them down. Even those who disagreed with Harris's policies admitted that in that moment she had embodied a higher standard. The crescendo of the narrative was this. America had been reminded that politics didn't have to be a reality show, that courage could look like calm, that respect could be revolutionary, and that, in the face of arrogance, the truest power was not a louder voice, but a steadier one. As the campaign season pressed forward, that one exchange became a rallying cry, not just for Harris's supporters, but for anyone who had ever been told they were too quiet, too different, or too polite to matter. The moral was undeniable. There was strength in stillness, courage in composure, and victory in refusing to play by the villain's rules. And yet, the story was not finished. The debate had ended, the moment had been claimed, but the battle for America's future was still ahead. The clash of values, dignity versus derision, was far from over. The only question was, would that moment of clarity carry forward when the stakes grew even higher? And so, as the lights dimmed on that unforgettable night, one truth lingered louder than all the noise. America had witnessed a clash not just of candidates, but of values. Donald Trump leaned on mockery, interruption, and volume. Kamala Harris answered with dignity, steadiness, and clarity. In a single moment, the contrast became undeniable. But this story isn't just about two people on a debate stage. It's about us. It's about the kind of country we want to be, the example we set for our children, and the legacy we leave for generations yet to come. Do we reward arrogance, or do we lift up composure? Do we settle for a politics of spectacle, or do we demand a politics of substance? The answer, as Harris showed, begins with courage. Not the courage to shout, but the courage to stand firm. The courage to believe in values bigger than any single insult. The courage to remember that dignity always outlasts derision. This is the moment to choose. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. Because history doesn't remember the loudest voice in the room. It remembers the voice that carried truth. If this moment moved you, if it made you feel seen, if it reminded you of the America you still believe in, then don't just nod along. Be part of it. Share the story. Talk about it with your friends. Subscribe, follow, and stay engaged. Because this isn't just Harris's fight, it's ours. The stage has been set, the lines have been drawn, and the next chapter is waiting to be written. By us. Because in the end, dignity doesn't just win debates, it wins nations.